Welcome to Signal's first LinkedIn Live. We are so happy that you're here and with us. My name is Kristen Ditch. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Signal, and I'm going to pass things over to Atul, our CTO, for today's session, AuthZ 101, the introduction to authorization you've always wanted.
Thanks, Kristen, and thank you everyone for spending time with me today to talk about this, really important topic of authorization. And I know it's probably something that you've had in your charter as an identity practitioner or decision maker, but I can probably say with confidence that most of you have seen the importance grow very recently, and now it's sort of front and center in terms of security, and for good reason. And we'll get into all that in a little bit. But before I jump into the topic, I just wanted to introduce myself. I am the CTO at Signal, which is a startup that started about 18 months ago, and we work in the area of authorization. So surprising that we're talking about authorization today. Before this, I was an engineer at Google, and I worked on the BeyondCorp devices API, which is a critical part of their BeyondCorp solution, which is sort of their pioneering, zero trust solution. And one of the things that I've been involved in both at Google and over here is the development of some critical standards to zero trust. There was a blog I posted when I was at Google called the Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol that now, that grew into a standards effort, which then merged with a group inside the OpenID Foundation. And sort of we created the Shared Signals Working Group. And it has defined these standards, the Shared Signal Framework, and the continuous access evaluation profile on top of that framework now. And I'm a co-chair of that effort, and so that's part of my responsibility here at Signal as well. And just by way of background, I've been involved in the identity space for a really long time. I have in fact contributed to some extent to developing the SAML standard. And our company at that time defined the idea of a federated identity server. And so it's something that now everyone uses. So been with identity for a few years now, and so let's jump right in. So a little bit of terminology I wanted to make sure we all sync up on before we get into the details. The first thing is you need to know when you're operating a web service, website or an application, or something that interacts with users on the web. You first need to know who that user is, and that process of knowing who the user is called authentication, right? And this is typically established until now using passwords. There's a growing popularity of things like passkeys, or some people also use multi-factor authentication other than passkeys, which could be your SMS based, text based authentication, or other mechanisms like that. But finally, it's about knowing who that user is. And to bring this into a real world analogy, right? So if you're at the airport and you want to get into the gate area, there's the sort of the TSA person that's checking who you are by looking at your passport or your driver's license, and then saying that, oh yeah, this is the person who's supposed to be on a flight in the near future, and so I'm going to let them into the gate area, right? And so that is authentication, right? What we're going to be talking about today is what happens after authentication, right? So now you know who the user is, and now you're trying to determine what that user can do, right? And this is sort of the area that is growing in importance for a number of reasons, and I'll get into that a little bit. But going back to the airport analogy a little bit, one of the authorization things that you see at an airport is, when you're trying to actually board your own flight, there's a gate agent that checks whether you have the seat on that flight, right? And that basically explains, that approves your entry into the plane, right? And so that is an authorization step in this airport example. All right. And so obviously this LinkedIn live session is going to be all about authorization. And one thing I would like to just clarify is that, while authorization is the actual decision of letting someone in, or letting someone take a certain action, or allowing someone to have a particular level of access, managing all that is essentially what is known as access management, right? So in an organization, you need to manage it at scale. There's a lot of aspects to it, and so today what we are really going to be talking about is access management. And just to clarify that when we say access, we are not sort of just saying just reading information. It could be any action, right? It could be your standard actions like what are known as the CRUD actions, create, relate, read, update, and delete. But it could be custom actions like an approval could be an action, or an applied discount could be an action. So all of these things are just called access, right? So when we say access, it could mean any of these things. And then, when you talk about access management, obviously the first thing that people end up talking about is policies, right? And policies are, treated differently in various kinds of systems. But fundamentally, policies are basically a statement of fact as to what a certain person or robotic principal can do at the time that they are trying to access a certain resource, right? And under what conditions is that allowed, under what condition is that not allowed. All those rules sort of make up the policies. And one thing to keep in mind is that any authorization system, right from the beginning, whenever they were created in the 60s, the intent has always been least privilege, right? You do not want to offer users privileges more than what they require to do their tasks, right? But it's always been the case, and this is something that we will see. We are just getting better at arriving at that least privilege requirement, but it has always been the intent right from the beginning. Now, let's take a quick look at how these systems have evolved, right? So, in the very beginning, in the mid 60s, you had, what is the predecessor to Linux or Unix, called Multics. And, it introduced this notion of access control lists for accessing, maybe root privileges on the system, right? And so it was just a named list of people that could access the system at a very powerful kind of level, right? Now, one thing to note is that this is also very relevant today. So it's not like because access control lists are old that they're somehow not useful today. They're really useful even today at the highest level of security, right? So in the airport example, what I would say is that if you wanted to decide who gets access to the control tower, right, the air traffic control, it's a highly secure function, and you want to be able to name the people that actually do have access to that air traffic control tower, right? And so that is an access control list, right? In the modern world, let's say you have a highly secure sort of infrastructure service that your entire business is running on. You want to name the actual people who may have the super admin level access to that infrastructure, right? And so access control lists, while they're old, they're still very useful. And you'll see this throughout the evolution of access management, that the older technologies do not sort of get phased out, they just sort of get limited in terms of scope. You're not going to use access control list everywhere today, but you're going to use it in certain high security kind of situations, right? And the next thing which is very popular today is the roles and groups kind of model, right? So as users got organized into directories, user directories, they got grouped into various groups, and those groups are kind of represent certain roles or job functions, you can say, which then can determine what you have access to, right? So that is sort of a popular way of organizing your access management in and it has been popular since the 90s, right? And so, in the airport example, even today, what you would say is, hey, people who need access to the pilot's lounge, they just need to be a pilot, right? You don't care, what certifications they have, whether they're on duty or not, those kinds of things. And so you just sort of use role-based access control even today, where it is appropriate, right? So, for example, if you wanted to determine who has access to a particular application within your organization, then yeah, that can be achieved today using roles and groups, right? But however, if you wanted to get more into the fine grained access, right, because if you wanted to define a role or a group for every file in your file system, that's going to be really hard, right? Let's say you have a shared drive and there are millions of files over there. You're not going to be able to define different roles for each one of those files, right? Because it's going to be an unmanageably or intractably complex problem, right? And so what you'll do instead is, the what has been popular since the mid 2000s is introducing what is known as attribute based access control, right? And so by using attributes, what you can do is simplify the policies so that they can be applied to various resources without having a policy explosion, right? And so you can say, let's say, someone with a clearance level, top secret or something, has access to top secret files. It doesn't matter which those particular files are, as long as they're tagged with that particular attribute. You allow that, and that's sort of how you express the policy. Again, in the pilot or airport example, if I'm a pilot who's certified to fly a certain type of plane, I should be able to read the technical specifications of that plane, right? It doesn't matter what I'm doing right now, because I'm maybe preparing for a flight or something like that. And that is what you can achieve with attribute based access control. Now, the most recent thing, which has been popular of late, is centralizing, access management. And what this does is it offloads the decision from individual applications into a central service, which decides for you, for every application, whether a particular access is allowed or not, right? And this is important because as monolithic applications have given way to microservices or distributed applications, you're seeing that you can't really have decision making about access everywhere and be consistent about it, or be or manage it well, right? So it becomes important to manage your access centrally, right? And the other thing is that in the zero trust world, hackers have become very sophisticated, right? So your attack surface has become much more identity oriented, and they're going to exploit every little possible access problem that allows users to do what they're not supposed to do. And so if you centralize, this is a good way of defending against these sophisticated kind of attacks, right? And just to reiterate that today you'll be using all of these strategies, right? So it's not like a one size fits all. You'll use even the access control list for the most secure functions maybe, but you might see the scope of the centralized access management to be much broader in the future, because that gives you the most amount of protection or the most sophistication in terms of what you can do, right? um, Going on, you know let's understand what is the outcome that we desire from an access management system, right? So the first thing is that users should not be disrupted, right? So if I'm trying to do my job, I should not even know that there is an access management system. I shouldn't have to request access for anything. I shouldn't have to stop my work in order for some system to tell me that now I'm allowed to do it. It should just be transparent and should not have any disruption, right? Now, at the same time, you cannot be very permissive about your privileges, because without narrowly defining those permissions, you're leaving open the possibility that if somebody masquerades as a user, now they have access to a large amount of data, right? And so you don't want that, because attackers, as you might know, that nowadays attacks are mostly identity based. They all in about 70 something percent include credentials compromise. And so you have to be really careful about what kind of privileges or permissions you offer to all your users, all your business users, not just some subset of users that are having access to like some critical systems, right? At the same time, now that you want to manage access for your whole set of users, you want to make sure that it is manageable at scale, right? So you cannot have a policy explosion. You cannot have like a role or group explosion. You want to be able to dynamically adjust these permissions as users change jobs, as they will start working on different things. It may be a temporary kind of elevation of privileges that they need for whatever it is they're doing. And everything that you do, including what accesses a user is performing, or what is being granted or denied, and as well what policies are being modified, how they're being modified and by whom. All of that needs to be auditable, right? So that you have a clear trace as to who did what in order to sort of change the access properties, right? And then you also need to know who was trying to access what, and then whether they got access, allowed or denied, and why did they get allowed or denied in that process, right? And so these are the outcomes that any access management system would want to give you, right? And so this kind of raises the questions. These are the questions that you would be curious about, which is, okay, I want policies, but then how are they managed and defined? How are those decisions for accessing individual resources being made? How are they being enforced? And what is the information, and where is the information coming from to make those decisions? And how are those decisions audited, right? And so what I'm going to present now is a rather complex kind of generalized architecture, but I'll walk you through it, so don't worry if you think this is a little sort of too weird. But basically what I would like to show here is that these are all the different components of an access management architecture, right? And you may have encountered these terms in the past, which is policy decision point or policy enforcement point, policy administration, policy information points. The one thing that I have here that you may not have seen before is what I'm calling the access audit point, right? Which is basically something that is able to audit all the decisions that that are happening both at the PDP and the administration of those policies, right? So now let's jump into each one of these components and talk about what they are, right? And so the policy administration point is where you define your policies. These might be defined in English language, and then somehow codified into groups or roles or attributes, as the case may be. Or these might be something that a system enables your business users to define in sort of a human readable kind of way, and is interpreted directly by your code, right? It's ideal situation that I'm describing, but be assured that it is actually possible today. And so the policy administration point lets you define these policies, and then the policies may be encoded in terms of rules and groups, or you may depend on other things that that are needed to make decisions, like let's say the users grouping, HR organization, or the user's current case assignments or things like that. All of that information is encoded into what is known as the policy information point, right? So these are systems that will provide the information that is required to make the decisions, right? And so here those decisions are being made in the policy decision point. Now, I'm showing this as a separate component from the application, but in many cases, the policy decision point is actually inside the application, because what the application is doing is simply reading the roles and groups from a directory and making its own decision about what those roles and groups mean in terms of access to that particular application, right? But in a centralized management architecture, this kind of policy decision point is outside the application, and which is how it is shown here, right? Um, and then the policy decision point may not just be about the user; it may also take contextual information, right? Like what is the user trying to access? Where are they coming from in terms of their IP address, their physical location? Are they coming from a managed device or not? Right. So all those context things can be considered in making that decision, right? And then you finally come to the part which enforces the access. So the user is actually trying to access an application, and the application has a component within it which is saying, "Oh, this user is trying to access this. Let me get a decision from the policy decision point." In some cases, that PDP might actually exist within the application. But if you logically think of it as a separate component, you may be doing some computation on, whether that user belongs to a particular role or something like that, or it may be a more involved computation that is offloaded to a centralized PDP. In any case, that policy enforcement point is then going to determine whether or not to let that access go forward. right? So that is the it is always or often integrated into the application. There may be a proxy architecture where it sits outside the application, but it's actually closely tied to the application. And then this is the new thing that you may not have seen in other diagrams that describe the access architecture, where you want to have a centralized audit of everything that's going on, right? Both in terms of the access decisions as well as in terms of the revisions being made to the policy, right? And if you have that audit, it becomes very easy for you to comply with any kind of regulations that need the authorities to know that who had access to what, whether they which users were able to access, were not able to access. And as you change your policies, you want to make sure that there is a trace of who made those changes and all that, right? So this is kind of what I had. I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Atul. That was great. And hopefully, if you have wondered what all of the acronym soup is that accompanies this industry, hopefully this has clarified what some of those often used terms are and what all of the abbreviations may mean. Before we jump into any questions, I just want to flag that we have already posted a registration for our next LinkedIn Live, where Atul will dig more into the different methodologies that combine all of these various approaches that he's discussed, all of these different components. And so we'll kind of walk through the pros and cons of different methodologies for access management, and then give our perspective on what we think is most impactful for a lot of organizations with really complex business use cases in access management. So please do feel free to join us on July 19th. I will go on ahead and drop a link in our chat here in a minute to that registration, but you can also just find it on our LinkedIn page. Taking a quick look at our Q&A, I believe we may have had a slight snafu with the chat coming through sufficiently. But the one message that I had received was kind of going back to that slide where you walk through the historical view of how these, yep, exactly, the evolution of these access management styles. The last line, if we'd go through the final click on this slide, is this point of an effective strategy employs all these methods wherever appropriate. How do you know which method, whether it's an attribute-based method or a list, is right for your use case?
Right. And I think that's sort of you can think of these as you have all these tools in your tool set, right? And so which is the right tool for any particular problem? What I would say is that if you have sort of a very highly secure named list kind of requirement, right, which is, let's say, who manages your Google Workspace account, right? Will be a very, very short list of people, right? Or who manages your AWS infrastructure, right? Not just accessing specific resources, who actually manages the users who will have access to AWS. Now, those kinds of things, right? Those obviously fit the mold of, let's say, the access control list area, right? Now, the roles and groups, you can think of using that where you need sort of coarse grained access control, right? So it's not great to use roles and groups where you may want like a very fine grained thing that, who can access specific files or specific customer records or, something like that. But, you may want to use it where, let's say, who has access to the HR app in general, right? Not what they can do within that app, but who can actually log into the HR app. Can easily be done using roles and groups, and you don't need more complication than that in that system, right? The attribute based access control you can use where you want specific fine-grained resources to be accessed or not accessed based on a user's sort of gradual or slow-moving kind of assignment, right? So you can localize that decision in a particular application. Let's say who has access to a particular file that has a certain security clearance required, right? Those are the kinds of things that you can do using attribute based access control. But if you really want more dynamic decision making, right? So who can access, who, if your policy says that, oh, I have, thousands of customer service representatives, and I want to make sure that only that customer service representative who's working on a particular case can have access to that particular customer's information. There's a lot of dynamism involved in this kind of decisions, right? And if you want really fine grained and very dynamic kind of policies, then you use the centralized approach, which also gives you the most amount of control, and it also gives you sort of most dynamism in that decision making.
Awesome. That was a great explanation. And as we move further to the right within this evolution of access management, we'll dig into how this manifests into different methodologies in our next session on July 19th. So definitely be sure to join that. Another question came in. I've seen a lot of interest in access management lately. Why do you think there's increased interest in this?
Yeah, so I think first of all is the nature of the attacks is changing, right? Because it used to be that hackers would target let's say a firewall or some network infrastructure, but in the zero trust world, it's really just the identities that are controlling access. And so the previous model where you would just sort of penetrate into some infrastructure and that get unlimited lateral movement within that infrastructure, those days are kind of dwindling, because the number of resources that are protected, using SaaS services or cloud-based services and all that is growing, and the only way to sort of get attack those systems is by subverting the identities. Now, when you're able to masquerade as someone who's a legitimate user, the sort of the most important line of defense after that is the sort of access management, right? What privileges that user has, right? And privileged access management used to be limited to these highly secure users, in terms of, okay, who can access our database at the row level, right? But now it's like about every user, because if any user is compromised, that user may have access to a lot of the data using those applications. And as a result, you want to make sure that you limit the user's abilities, as and when they are doing certain tasks, and not just sort of a global superset of everything that they could ever do as a part of their job, right? And so this is why access management is now becoming more and more important, because there is a lot of dynamism required, and by way of policy, to limit the damage from any kind of credential compromise attack.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate all of the questions. If you think of any questions after today's call, feel free to reach out to myself or Atul on LinkedIn. Reach out to us from our website. We'd be happy to get those questions answered for you. But thank you so much for joining. We will share out this recording in case there's anyone on your team who'd be interested in watching this. And also feel free to subscribe to the Signal blog. We're posting on there frequently about topics like this, as well as how you can actually implement these ideas to create a zero trust environment for your identity access management program. So thanks so much for joining, and we will see you again on July 19th. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.